Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole. On today's episode, we have Aspen. Join us for another Relationship Anarchy research conversation. Together we talk about deconstructing the narrative of single, bringing the romantic into the platonic, and how great freedom comes with great responsibility. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. My name is Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist with training in psychedelic integration therapy. And I am also the founder of the Pleasure Practice, supporting individuals in crafting expansive sex lives and intimate relationships. Dear listener, I have such exciting news to share with you. I passed my dissertation on relationship anarchy, y'all. That was the last piece of the academic component of my doctorate, and now I just have my clinicals, and I will be out by the summertime, which is so exciting, and it has been such a joy to have these conversations on the podcast that started with my dissertation research. And every time I have one of these conversations, I learn from each one of you. Relationship anarchy is a movement, right? And so your voice matters. Dear listener, if you are a relationship anarchist, I want to talk to you. I want to learn from you. I want to share your wisdom with our community. And so there is a link in the show notes below for you to answer the relationship anarchy research questions, for you to join me on the show, and I'd be honored to have you. And gosh, dear listener, there are so many ways that the patriarchy is taking power, so many different ways. And one of the ways that I think about relationship anarchy is certainly about sex, right? All the different power structures that are there, all the different power structures of patriarchy that are there. And wow, the other day, I have to share with you, I came home to my apartment, and in my apartment, I had two men that I love. Two men that were cooking me dinner. Talk about rewriting gender stereotypes and norms. Two men cooking me dinner. And together, we co-created the highest forms of pleasure in our bodies, in our hearts, and with our breath. And I just know that my feminist ancestors would be so proud of me to be rewriting the narratives. And although the patriarchy is taking power in many ways, the patriarchy will certainly not take power within my bedroom. Dear listener, we are going to keep having pleasure conversations in this space. I promise that my voice will continue to stay loud, authentic, and free to speak to these things, despite what may come for the future. All right, dear listener, if you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com, linked in the show notes below. And I want to say the biggest thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the podcast, keeping this content free and accessible to all people. So thank you. If you want to join the Patreon community, get exclusive access into my research and personal exploration, then you can head on over to patreon.com/modernanarchypodcast. And with that, dear listener, please know that I am sending you all my love, and let's tune in to today's episode. And then the first question I like to ask each guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah. Hi. It's a good question. I have been listening to the podcast for a while now, so I should be prepared. At least, yeah, you can call me Aspen, 19. I'm still hanging on to that like young person perspective for a while now. And
Sure.
that's kind of what got me interested in giving the feedback and talking about it. I am queer and kinky, and I'm an anarchist in the old fashioned sense of the word and in the relationshipy sense of the word. So,
Yeah.
yeah, live in the Pacific Northwest and currently trying to find cool things to do in life, whether
Exciting.
they
Well,
be for money or not.
yeah, sure, sure, sure. Well, I'm excited to have you on the podcast today and get to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, relationship anarchy. So thank you for trusting me and joining me and all the listeners today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Of
Appreciate it.
course. Well, the first big question, what is relationship anarchy?
Yeah. I mean, the way I conceptualize it, and I know a lot of people have a lot of different interpretations and definitions, and it probably carries a lot of common themes across, but I conceptualize it as applying anarchist principles to the interpersonal dynamic. So that's principles like disassembling power structures, not having any institutionalized hierarchy, free association as well is one. With that one, I feel like there's some people who are in more monogamish situations who are relationship anarchists, and I respect that. And I'm not trying to like say that you should be polyamorous or so, but just the way I was introduced to it was with free association, which is a lot more in that kind of polyamorous sphere. So I'd be interested in learning more. It wasn't until listening to your podcast that I realized that people were monogamish and relationship anarchists.
Sure.
So yeah, it's a very abstract the way that I just described it.
Yeah.
Maybe grounding it a bit more is like not taking any structure to be a given when forming a relationship, and instead just co-creating the relationship that you want with the people that you meet. Is
Mhm.
that's the way that I try and explain it to people who maybe aren't anarchists or aren't super familiar with it.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, getting out of the prescriptive ways of being into the creativity of writing your own narrative, your own story, your own relationship. Yeah. And
Exactly.
you had mentioned the ways that you're dismantling power structures. I'm already thinking of a million different power structures that we'd be dismantling, and I'm curious if any are coming to mind for you that you've experienced and navigated.
Yeah, totally. Just in my own life, I am fairly new to relationship anarchy, like maybe like a year in or so. And before that, I'm fairly new to relationships. I've just had like one serious relationship in my life, romantic.
Sure.
I have
Yeah.
many, many other serious relationships in my
There's the
um
anarchist. Yeah.
yeah, but a lot of my experience has been informed by power structures, whether it be internalized queerphobia or internalized patriarchy, um, machismo as well.
Mhm.
And the way it's come up of like a kind of a possessive or an ownership, it's very extremely hierarchical and extremely damaging. So being able to step outside the paradigm of I am yours, you are mine, has been a huge one for
Mhm.
intense relationships for me, and like
Mhm.
probably one of the healthiest steps that I've been able to take.
Yeah, absolutely. To not have to find security through ownership of someone, right? What a powerful mind shift and paradigm.
Yeah, exactly. Unless it's like in a consensual kinky setting,
Kinky,
then,
yeah, totally.
but
And I,
it
go
no,
ahead.
go ahead.
I like to play with it too, where I'm like, oh,
Yeah,
like this pussy's all yours, even though I know it's absolutely not. You know what I mean? Like, there's no way where this person has any control over me, but I'll say that because it's fun to play with. Or
exactly.
other relationships where you're like, oh, this is like, we use that sort of term of possessiveness, in other ways that are not restrictive. I think you'd say, oh, this is my friend, this is my
Yeah,
best friend. Like, that is my, but it's not in a possessive of controlling their actions way. So I might say this is my person, right? But not in a possessive controlling their actions sort of way.
the limitations of the English language, but
Sure.
so when you use words like that, you could be meaning like radically different things. You could be
Mhm.
meaning ownership, or you could meaning in reference to self, right?
Right,
So like
right,
this is the relationship that this person holds in reference to myself, right? This is
right,
my friend, this is my partner, versus this is my friend, like
right,
person who is a friend is my, property.
mm,
And
right.
I see people like that with the limitations of language, even like a lot of people aren't sure what they mean when they do say those words. So
Hmm.
yeah, not taking
Yeah.
anything for granted.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, is deconstructing the meaning of those. When you say that word, what does that mean to you? This is what it means to me. And can we at
Mhm.
least get close to a similar page of what our intentions are with that word, right? Obviously, we'll never be on the same exact page because we're locked in our own heads up here. But getting closer than at least unexamining many of these words and examining many of these practices that we have. So, actually getting deep into what that means for each individual person.
Completely, 1000%. That's what is relationship anarchy for me. It's basically just been doing that a whole bunch of questioning, getting really meta and annoying about it,
I
like
know, right?
over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think that hopefully I'll still get to the end of my life if I'm lucky to live many years and still be deconstructing what it means to examine power structures, right?
Absolutely. In so many areas. I find it wild where some people, their politics can be like so radically anti-authoritarian, but their interpersonal is like they just like take all these things for granted and just reinforce all these power structures. Or on the flip side, someone who's like really into like poly stuff or relationship, calls himself a relationship anarchist, but then in the more political life lens will just accept and take all these power structures for granted. It's like on all spaces we need to be thinking critically about like what is this dynamic and why does this hierarchy exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Because a big piece of relationship anarchy, from my understanding, is letting go of the hierarchy that places sexual and romantic dynamics over platonic connections, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so when you start to get into that space of really being intentional about all of your relationships, right? Yeah, what does it mean to be intentional about my community of people that I see,
Mm-hmm.
on a weekly, monthly, yearly basis, as well as my larger, broader community that I live in, my
Mm-hmm.
country, the world, the planet that I live, right? Like, so then you start to
Yeah,
see the political nature of how it's not just about your close inner circle of the romantic or sexual. It is a much broader examination of our relationships to all people. Some people will even include beings, right? Animals, the ecology, the climate, right? Like you start to get really meta on what relationship means. I mean, even studying psychedelics and drugs, we always talk about your relationship to drugs and
mm-hmm.
everything I've learned about chaotic use is that it always comes back to your relationships, right? And so for me, that word relationship ends up getting very used, I think, appropriately across many different formations, not just people. What's your relationship to this substance, to this blank, right? Like these are different relationships that we have.
Completely. I was talking with that with a friend a little while ago about like how applying relationship anarchy to substances is like the same way that it can help counter toxic monogamy in the
Hmm.
interpersonal, it can help counter like toxic relationships with substances as well. Because as soon as there's some sort of power differential, you know something's not okay, or as soon as you're spending all your time with one, you know it's not okay. So like I was smoking cigarettes and weed every day for the past year and a bit until New Year's, and I started realizing like, oh, I'm like dependent. Like I need this. Like this substance is telling me that I need to come to it. And I'm like, I don't, that doesn't feel right to me. So
Mhm.
my kind of like little anti-authoritarian brain kicks in and I'm like, well, fuck you then. And like I quit.
Yeah.
It was easier for me. It was easier for me to quit because I was like, I don't want this entity to have control over me. Yeah. I don't know if,
Yeah.
yeah, that relates and makes sense, but
Sure. Yeah. To examine just power structures in general, right? And so for that to be
mhm,
the important narrative for you in terms of rewriting a new relationship to the
mhm,
substance where there's more agency on your part, more autonomy, right? To be able to have a different relationship with it. I definitely think about when if I'm thinking about like drug use and relationship anarchy, I'm certainly thinking about, like the war on drugs, the messages, the racialization of those attacks, right? I'm thinking about the narratives of, yeah, what we've been sold about drugs and how that impacts our relationship to them, right? Oof, big.
totally.
Little, let alone all the research on Rat Park, which I always talk about in the podcast of the ways that drug use, they had done the study with rats, but drug use, they had cocaine and heroin water and drank it to excess. Yeah, yeah,
I've
yeah.
heard about probably on
Cool.
your podcast.
Yeah. Cool. I love that. Great. Yeah. It was a pretty radical thing for me to learn about too.
Mhm,
But yeah, when they drink it to excess in the cage compared to opening up the cage to a whole rat park where you could play and have different rats. And in that cage, they barely touch the heroin or cocaine water. So I
mhm.
think that even in our relationship to substances, if we're thinking about anarchy and power structures, we have to ask that bigger question of what is the cage, the systems that we're all in that are contributing to these chaotic use of substance to ameliorate some of the pain that we're in as a society. Like that makes sense, right? So, oof, I
Absolutely.
could go down a rabbit hole.
No, yeah, I agree with that 1000%. And what I was saying earlier wasn't to, yeah, say that substance use is wrong necessarily.
No.
Yeah, even if people do have like dependencies, like that's not wrong. It's the context that you exist within, right? Yeah, the racialization and the war on drugs and that stigma that's been so interwoven into altering your mind or altering your reality, it's brutal. It's almost like this system creates a condition that is unlivable for so many people and then shames anyone who tries to alter their perception of that or put some sort of barrier in their mind in between that and themselves. The system is then shaming and criminalizing and attacking those people because they want them to experience it fully raw and unfettered, which
Right.
is scary to me. Um,
Right. 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 And then like legalizing some of it, right? Because then you think
mhm,
about like all the stuff with Oxy and all the wild documentaries you can watch on that where that was a legal painkiller, right? Not addictive. That's in big air quotes. That's the whole problem here.
yeah.
Um, or even for myself, like when I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder in the past, which I'm very anti-DSM these days, but in the past, that's what I was given. And I was put on an SSRI. So then for a couple of years, every single day, I took a drug to alter my reality. But that drug's okay, right? Under our sad capitalistic world, that drug you can definitely take all day. Let alone the fact that they gave me a as needed PRN Clonopin, right? A
Mhm.
benzo. Like you can take this whenever you're stressed out. Here you go, right? Like talk about which drugs are okay, which drugs are not. Whoa, okay.
Yeah, totally. Once you start seeing like how arbitrary it all is, once you see like old medicine bottles that have like this is a mix of heroin, cocaine, cannabis, like yeah, you start questioning power structures. Like who is it that gets to deem X okay or X not okay, you know? And why do they have that authority and why do they have that control? And what are the impacts of that on our society and our populations?
Mhm.
And yeah, why are things legalized when? It's usually for profit. Like usually profit dictates it if you trace it well enough. And it's almost like scary, I find a lot of times, to start questioning these things or have these thoughts or have a distrust, because it's really easy to think like, oh, the medical system or the economic system or the political system or the system I use in my interpersonal relationships, I can trust that. I can take that for granted. That isn't inherently harmful. And maybe it isn't harmful for you or your context. But once you realize that the people running that are just humans, same as you, flawed, same as you, and that there isn't anything inherently sacred about it, and that it maybe is harmful for a lot of people, then you almost have a responsibility to start taking that into your own sphere and taking agency over your own life, and where you could have ascribed it to like something else in the past.
Yeah, once the matrix starts to break down, it's a little bit of a darker road. You're like, oh no, I can't just believe that it's all good and wholesome out there, right? And I think the more privileges that we have, the further you can be from that reality, of course, right? When you
Mm-hmm.
less privileged, you're confronting that reality every single day that this system does not show up for you. You can't get access to healthcare, stable housing, all that. So it's very there. And then I think the people who have more and more privilege are further from that reality. But even then, I feel like this like hyper individualistic, very consumer based culture. I mean, we have some of the highest rates of depression and suicide.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how happy we really are at the top either. So I think that we're all suffering in very different ways, to be clear, different ways depending on how much privilege you have. But absolutely, I don't think that this system is working for many of us. And so then what does it mean to take that and then take action in our communities, in our close interpersonal relationships, and then to really trust the ripples of that when we're
Mm-hmm.
showing up for the people around us and being present, giving back, like trusting in the ripples of that to actually make long-term change throughout future generations.
Totally. Absolutely. I've definitely seen like people come into activist spaces like with more privilege and with more of a background of just like taking all these structures for granted that they work and they're positive. And obviously, like for someone who experiences marginalization, their life is a lot harder than it has been for these other people with more privilege and with more background. And I'm not trying to diminish that in any way, but just what I've observed is like psychologically, it's really hard if you take these things for granted, if you take these things as inherent positives, that these aren't problems, if these systems haven't been adversely impacting you your whole life. And you realize, and then you put yourself in a context where you suddenly realize the problems all at once, it can be very overwhelming. And you're going to need like solid support systems as well for that. But I also like what you said about like once you start thinking about those things, you have agency and to be able to enact in your life and start build the structures and trust the ripples and go forward. It's I really enjoy being able to go forward with a an intentional or conscious way of like, yeah, like how does this contribute positively,
Hmm.
how can we set up our own structures and our own systems,
Right.
that are able to flourish, once we don't have this script that we're being fed, how can we like write it ourselves and co-create it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you had talked a little bit about kink and queerness, and I think
Hmm.
that that is, as someone that dabbles in research in the sex and relationship space, whoa, my goodness, the amount of power structures. I mean, so we're talking about drugs, right? Power and ownership over your body, okay? So, and also power and ownership over pleasure starts to get really close to the sex space, right? And like all the different narratives that are implicit in our culture around this. Oh my God, I can easily see the rest of my life still just scratching the surface of how deep this goes into our subconscious and psyches. But I'm curious to hear your take on power structures around sexuality and pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I view it around sexuality is we have like almost like a class structure, but it's older than any economic or political structure that we have. But cis heteropatriarchy, the way that it reduces people's identities and fluidity into very rigid boxes. You know, you're male or you're female. Male is on top, female is serving the needs of male. You're, you know, heterosexually paired off in that way. And if you exist outside of that paradigm, then usually sexual violence is enacted to try and force you back into that paradigm. It's something that's followed like Western civilization. It's quite brutal, but it's also so deeply internalized. Like I know I have a lot of queer phobia that I've deeply internalized myself that I'm working through with therapy every week.
Right.
Um, Stigma around sexual pleasure or substances, it's definitely present in my life. It's been because of my upbringing. Like my parents were hippies. I grew up on the
Mm,
side of the mountain.
cool.
Everyone like was smoking and selling weed, and pretty sex positive. And that's also like some of the reason I wanted to come on and talk was because coming at this from a young person, I maybe don't have all the experiences that some of your guests have or that you've had of experiencing this like hype religious Christian. You know, I was raised atheist, I was raised hippie, I was raised progressive.
Lucky.
Like there's less there's less of that stigma baked in, and especially coming at it at a younger age, it's, I don't know, less life experience, more neuroplasticity. There's an ability to just accept things a little bit more. That stigma is rooted within our culture and interwoven. And when it comes to like the queer phobia, I think that's a lot more deeply internalized in me. But when it comes to like sexual pleasure and drug use, those are things that aren't as tough to reckon with or grapple with just because of the context that I was brought up in.
Great. Right? Like that's what we hope for. We hope for future
Mm-hmm.
generations that they never have to go through the same experience, that it's at least easier. Because, yeah, at 19, I was going to church every Sunday, praying to God and condemning the queers and anyone who was sex
Mm-hmm.
positive, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
wow, I'm so happy that you were not in that space and that you were thriving outside of that, right? And so I continue to hope in that joy for future generations. And I'm conscious too of just the questions here, and so I want to make sure I keep. I have a hard time with these because then I'm like, oh, we could just talk, and I'm like, there's questions I need to guide us towards. And so I'm curious in talking about this and the ways that you have, that beginner's mindset as you're coming to this. How would you describe your practice of relationship anarchy?
Yeah. For me, it's a polyamorous experience. So I very much have free association in the ways that I don't restrict the people who I'm with, who they can be with in any romantic or sexual sense. And I don't necessarily want that restriction on me. I also have started to learn about the different types of attraction that are out there: romantic, sexual, sensual, aesthetic, platonic, and start picking these apart and unbundling them from the little packages that we've been given, and then kind of building relationships that can incorporate any myriad of those. So right now, my relationships look like I'm in a queer platonic relationship with two besties. And so the three of us, like we each individually have our own relationships, and then the three of us together is like
Yeah.
its relationship as a whole. And that's been going on since about a year. So we kind of like
Mm.
came and found this together. It's funny, we were actually, the three of us were like spending a lot of time together, and we were joking. We're like, we're not friends, we're not lovers, we're a secret third thing. And that was like the joke for a while.
Cute.
And then I'd mentioned something about how I'd heard about relationship anarchy, and one of my other friends she eventually like came up and she's like, "You guys, I think I found what the secret third thing is," and like talked all about
Cute.
queer relationships and stuff. So yeah.
Yeah.
And then outside of that, I've been going on dates and experimenting with romance as well. But I've also been pretty romance adverse for the past 2 years, because of my prior relationship and some of the trauma that came with that. So it's mainly been non-romantic for me, but now I'm starting to explore and experiment with romance as well, with different people, and also recognize the romance that existed in friendships that I just completely ignored because my brain categorized that as friends. Okay, that's
Yeah.
that's my
That's your
end of
answer.
rant.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to say about that, the romance of friendships and platonic connections, and just getting, we had started the conversation talking about getting curious about the
Mhm.
language we use and what it means, right? And so the word romance, what does that even mean, right? Where does
Mhm.
that narrative start in the 1800s, right? And that lineage of that word, and what does that mean? And so yeah, to have that sort of curiosity and then to see romance in your platonic connections of giving them flowers, writing them sweet cards, calling them your beloved, for me, that level of reflection brings so much more vibrancy and hues, like these full, bright colors to my life, rather than looking at this one person or even in a polydynamic, two, three, wherever you draw your capacities of time and energy, as wow, these are the people that I love. These are the people versus whoa, I actually have a
Yeah.
whole relationship with this. Oh my God. Like it's like the psychedelic trip where all the colors are really heightened, right? And you're like, damn, everything's so beautiful, right? So that level of intentionality, I think, is a really powerful transformation that would help so many people who are, I don't even use this word, single. I'm single. Or are you single? You have
Yeah.
no relationships at all in your entire life?
Yeah.
Like what a narrative to tell yourself. And if we know anything about psychology is like we are the narratives we tell ourselves, right? And so to say I'm completely alone, isolated, and single.
Absolutely. To reduce yourself to a singularity and define yourself based on a lack of this like other, this promised other that will supposedly fulfill your needs and make you somehow whole. Yeah, if you take that perspective, I've been quote unquote single for like
Mm.
2.5 years. But it does not feel that way at all. Like
Yeah.
I have a lot of really fulfilling relationships, and a lot of people in the world today are very lonely and feel very isolated in our individualistic culture with a lack of community. And it's like a psychedelic trip where suddenly all the colors are heightened and vibrant when you are able to like, yeah, bring romantic into the platonic and like recognize all this beauty and deep connection and
Mhm.
maybe flirtatious fun feelings around a myriad of interactions is really
Mhm.
nice. In my own experience, like I've had platonic connections, and this is like before I discovered relationship anarchy, and they were definitely like just inherently and naturally romantic. Even with friends who were a monogamous couple, I'd spend time with them, and the vibes were there. I don't know how to
Mhm.
describe it any other way.
Sure.
Like not like sexual at all, but just like romantic vibes were there.
Yeah.
And I was just unable to conceptualize that until I was more exploring and questioning and not taking things for granted, so to speak, and being able to like come back and recognize that it's almost like sweet in a little bit, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. A level of presence,
Hmm.
intentionality that can be really
Hmm.
transformational. And I know you had mentioned free association. I have been using the word sexual self-governance, right, to
Hmm.
honor the interconnectedness of that self-governance is like our anarchist term, of course. Like we always know the self is in relation. So in my
Hmm.
sexual self-governance, of course, like STD tests, fluid bondings, like all of that sort of stuff is obviously in there. I don't just move as this free entity. That would be libertarianism, right? But
Yeah.
apart from that, I think it's really beautiful to think about the abundance that you can flow into with that in terms of expressing yourself. Talk about power structures. Wow, as someone who's been conditioned as a woman, the Madonna and the whore complex is deep within me. And so the idea of having multiple people that I'm having sex with, wow, what a journey to unpack that one. Many tears, many confused experiences. But I love this space of abundance and freedom and all that. And I think there is, at least in my world, some restrictions with that. I think it's hard for me when people are like, there's no rules. I'm like, I think there actually are rules, maybe just not talked about. How would you feel if I had sex with your brother? I think you'd be upset, dear friend, right? You know what I mean? Like, or your parents, or your blank, or your coworkers, or this. And so for me, I always think like there is some level of restriction. It's just always a question of like, are we consenting this together? Can we talk about that? At least in my book, like like I would feel very uncomfortable if one of my partners slept with my sister. Like that would feel very uncomfortable for me. But I think that's another space where often we don't even talk about it. We're just like, oh, there's no rules. I'm like, I think there still are a little bit of rules here, and that's okay. Like I think having some level of boundaries of what feels comfortable is still important to talk about. So yeah,
I,
and I just
I
I see that in the community sometimes.
I really like that concept of like sexual self-governance because free association, I've been using that term because my anarchist brain just like
Mhm.
likes globbing on to, but I could see totally how it could be applied in a very, and actually I have witnessed how it's applied in like a not so great way.
Mm.
Um,
Well,
definitely,
yeah,
luckily, like not impacting me or any of my relationships, but just
sure.
in communities, I've seen that. A lot of it does come down to having caring and having empathy and respect for those around you, and caring enough to like check in because what some people are uncomfortable with and are not okay with, other people are totally fine with. And bringing that, it's not like you can just go forward and do whatever. I feel like this about anarchy too. It's not like there are no rules and you can just do whatever you want
Right.
with no repercussions. It's like, no, now that you're not taking some script or some narrative or some power structure inherent, there's more obligation and more
Yep.
responsibility on you to be able to, take into consideration all the things that that power
Right.
structure was taking into consideration. Even if that power structure was doing it in a harmful way, it was still taking these things into consideration, and now that's on you. So you have like a responsibility in that sense to be able to have the tough conversations, and figure out and establish like what is and isn't okay. Because when it comes to romantic and sexual and strong platonic interactions, like people's feelings can get hurt and people can
Yeah.
get hurt. The understanding, like the cliche, the Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, I'd say like with great freedom comes great
Oh
responsibility,
yeah.
to those around you.
Yes, absolutely. Ideally, right? In the best case scenario, yes. I think about Sauna Healing Collective, where I've been doing my psychedelic training, right, as a non-hierarchical space. What that means is there's no boss at the top that gets to say, this is what the collective is doing, done, done, done. But what that means on the other side is that you have to get the whole collective together to make a choice, right? Which
Yeah.
is more responsibility now because who's got free time? What times are you available? You're right. It is more work inherently
Mhm.
to coordinate the whole group together so that you make a non-hierarchical decision about where the collective is going, right? And so it takes
Totally.
that intentional level of added work to it rather than someone at the top who says, this is what we're doing.
Hmm.
So I think that that's another piece of it too, where yeah, people just think, oh, I have all this freedom, I have all this power, but like you're saying, it actually means more responsibility to check in with your broader network of people that you're connected to and how you're impacting them. And I think that's where I talked about this in my jealousy guide on my website and the book of, the sexual self governance is in your interconnectedness. right? Because I think that just
Mm.
like free association, someone could be like, well, I'm sexually self-governing. Like, don't tell me what to do with my body. It's like, well,
Yeah,
yeah, but you got to tell me if you have unprotected sex, my friend, because that puts me at a risk, right? Like, it's not just like, fuck
totally.
everybody, I'm a libertarian. Like it's like you
Yeah.
have to talk. And so with that added freedom, with that added ability, you're right, Spider-Man, sure, added responsibility, added intentionality, right, to the people that are around
Mhm.
you.
Totally. Absolutely. It's interesting the different labels and words and the meaning we ascribe to them.
How deep do we want to go down that rabbit hole, right? You
Exactly,
could.
exactly. I like,
Yeah.
yeah, my conception of the term libertarian has always been like a more positive one in the political sense, but I'm also not American, and y'all's libertarians are whack. So it totally fits like that,
Yeah.
trying to access freedom, but in a way that can be very selfish and harmful and actually include power structures perfectly worded. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it can be a lot of work to try and like take on the feelings of everyone around you as well. And it can almost seem like really hard and difficult. And a lot of people in monogamous relationships like will fantasize or like create some conception of like what it must be like to just like not have monogamy and being able to just go out there and sleep with whoever and experience deep romantic connection with whoever and like just be on a whim. And like there are people who do that, yeah, but a lot of times it comes round. So I honestly, with the amount of energy that I have myself and the amount of capacity I have myself, it's hard to just maintain like a few core relationships,
Right.
and just put that time and energy to be able to do, like, it's better to do like a small amount right than it is to just go out there
Mhm.
and do crazy amount but be spreading harm along the way.
Right, right. Quality over quantity.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
I'm curious too, like guiding us towards the next question, which I know we're hitting on it in so many different ways, but why do you practice relationship anarchy? Why is this important to you?
I have particular ways that I attract and that I feel safe in relationships and that I go forward. And I'm really attracted to the idea of being able to explicitly design something that meets mine and meets other people's needs. Yeah, I've had toxic monogamy in the past, and that's affected me deeply. And not to say like my relationship style now is a reaction to that or is defined because of that, but rather I've come to an understanding or a lifestyle or a way of being that is very healing and allows me to work with intentionally my different traumas or being able to like see like what does work, what doesn't work, and like almost intentionally plan and like bring a certain level of consciousness into it. So
Hmm.
for me, relationship anarchy like allows me to design something that is effective, that is nourishing, that is fulfilling, but also like meets different adverse needs that maybe wouldn't be considered in like the traditional package of boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner, romantic, sexual, platonic divide. Like those packages that are given to you doesn't work very well for me. So yeah, I guess intentionality and being able to decide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big thing that comes out of that I saw in my research work is the embrace of change, right? This sort of intentional relationship creation, having conversations, and in that embracing the reality that relationships will change. And ideally, we hope for the better. We grow more intimacy, we grow closer, we understand each other better. And also, desires can change. The structures that fit well for the both of you can change. And so I really appreciate this embrace of that reality and that continual check-in rather than this is the relationship escalator we're going on, this is the way. It's more of that fluid, okay, where are we at right now? Where are we at right now? Again, right? And continually asking that question. Oh, I find that to be some of the most like authentic and dynamic, beautiful relationship structures when you're having that intentional reflection and dialogue and creation.
Absolutely. I remember like right when I got into it, like me and all my friends were doing the smorgasbord and like
Yeah.
over and over. And then, that kind of excitement of that, discovering that died out a bit and people fell into patterns and then things happened, people moved, context
Sure.
changed. And then it's like, I think we ought to bring this out again. Like we need to recheck in. Like our relationship does not match what we said it would be, and because of natural processes. So we should go in and check in again on all these points and see where we are explicitly and what we want explicitly on all these points.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I feel like we're already hitting on the next question, which is how does relationship anarchy impact your practice of intimacy? I'm hearing the different ways that, yeah, it is this embrace of change and conversation and reflecting on different tools like the smorgasbord. And I'm curious, are there any other ways that you see relationship anarchy impacting your practice of intimacy?
Yeah, completely. Well, we talked earlier about like how it allows you to bring intimacy into relationships that would have been stripped of it traditionally. So like different platonic relationships that are like it's almost like you're not allowed to consider that a certain level of intimacy, or you're not allowed to consider that intimacy as important or you feel as nourished from it. So that was a huge one, brightening that
Hmm.
landscape
Yeah.
of relationships around me, and bringing intimacy into places where it maybe isn't traditionally allotted to. Yeah, and then also when things are overwhelming, my natural response is to just shut down, but that doesn't really fly if you're trying to maintain complex relationship dynamics. So it's forced me to learn how to communicate better, and it's made me more intentional and conscious in my intimate relationships. I've learned to be a lot more explicit. I've learned to get in touch with specifically what my needs are, specifically what my boundaries are, and then be able to share those with people, relevant people in my life. Yeah, my practice of intimacy has differed from that because, yeah, I've been able to diversify it, decentralize it, and so to
Hmm.
speak. And then I've also been able to add that intentional component and been able to grow in that space of becoming more intentional with it and more explicit with it.
Hmm. Hmm. And if you're anything like me, often learning through mistakes of going, oh shit,
Yep,
I gotta be better here. Here we go over here, right? Oh, another. Oh, okay.
exactly. Exactly. 1000.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious in that line, that vein. What are some of the difficulties that you've experienced with relationship anarchy?
Communication is a huge one. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
like I said, it's easy for me to withdraw when things are too overwhelming for me. When I have a low capacity, I kind of just shut down. And being in relationships with different people and like they need certain communication, and we have to co-create ways for me to be able to provide that. And then other difficulties which are just more generic as well is people not being relationship anarchists or not
Sure.
having these conceptions. So tomorrow I'm going to be meeting with someone who I've gone on a few dates with and really like them, but last time we talked, we said something that was very much along the lines of the more I become girlfriend, boyfriend with someone, and then they don't want all the commitment that comes with that. So then I have a problem with that, and they just want to be friends. And like going into this relationship, I'm like, okay, so you have an idea of what it means to be a partner, and it is not the idea that I have because we're two different people with two like radically different backgrounds. So like tomorrow I'm going to be like, hey, have you heard of the relationship escalator? What does this look like for you? Like, so being able to have those conversations and reconciling what your needs and your capacity are with what the needs and capacity of other people. It's difficult. It's
Mm-hmm.
tricky. It can be so much easier to just like spend your time with this person having fun or doing what feels good. Instead, you're like, okay, I'm going to take my limited time and energy and I'm going to bring up this topic that is hard to talk about. And we're going to like hash it out and communicate needs, boundaries, and capacity,
Yeah.
which is what it
Yeah.
seems to come down to is needs, boundaries, and capacity over and over
Sure.
again.
Right. Absolutely. So a lot of conversation, especially up
Mhm,
front. I feel like when you're starting to meet someone and get
mhm,
to know them, I think those are such important conversations to have to make sure that you're not, it's almost like harm reduction philosophy and pleasure enhancement, which I think are connected. But right, there's a level of harm reduction to have some sort of conversation about this rather than just going months of not talking about it. And then that person
mhm,
has projected a whole future where you're
mhm.
married to them in a monogamous living together context with two kids, and you say, wow, I had not thought about any of that actually. Hold on, wait, what? And then they're
Yeah,
crying, you're crying, everyone's upset, right? So
yeah.
so being able to have those conversations up front, which I find to be really fun. Like it's like such a nice
Hmm.
litmus test of like, cool, like yeah, what are your capacities for connection? Obviously it changes, don't get me wrong. But like what are your capacities right now? Like what are you excited about? What sort of connections? What does the word boyfriend, girlfriend mean to you? What does the word partner mean to you, right? And you can learn so much about someone by how they respond to that and their ability to communicate that. And I feel like one of the big things too is like emotional support. That's like one that frequently in like communication styles that we just never spend the time talking about. But the more clarity that we do find, the less harm and hurt we have down the line
Yeah.
and the more pleasure, because of course these
Hmm.
people in our lives are not mind readers. So if we can get clear with them to say, hey, this is the amount of contact that feels really good to me, this is the amount of enmeshment that feels really good to me, right? That's also how we get our desires met, is actually having these conversations rather than like pouting in a corner being like, well, why didn't they do this, but we never actually asked for it, but I'm still mad that they didn't read my mind, right? Like
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah, yeah.
1000%. Yeah, the mind reading one is like, yeah, I've
We've all
in
been there.
yeah, in past relationships, I've been like, well, I can't read your mind. I've said that like multiple times, all like, but then being on the other side and being like, oh, they can't read my mind. Like I have to say something. It's real. And even when you think like that your communication is good, even when you think that like you're on top of it all, there's gonna be some things that you're taking for granted. So being able to like have those check-ins and feel like comfortable and confident enough to be able to communicate. I find that's also like a barrier sometimes. If you're not super self-confident, you can't communicate as your boundaries or your needs super well. And if you don't feel super comfortable in a context, then you're gonna want to have walls and be defensive. And that also limits your ability to communicate. And you have to be able to come in with a certain capacity as well for communication. And that
Mhm.
can be a limitation sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I've learned anything about psychology, it's that we grow in relationships. So finding relationships where someone gently like opens you up to a new perspective or shows you a level of care and love and communication that is new, right? That's where we grow and we expand. And that's, at least for me, one of the many joys of relationship anarchy is finding these really beautiful humans that have shown me a level of love, communication, empathy that has radicalized my whole life. And so I'm curious for you, what are some of the joys of relationship anarchy that you've encountered?
Absolutely. There's many, many joys. One of the immediate joys for me was dropping jealousy and not dropping it as in I don't feel it anymore or it doesn't
Sure.
impact my life anymore because it's always there and it's good to be able to be in touch with like those feelings, but dropping it in a way as like my ego or my sense of self is damaged if I don't react in an intense way because of this, and being able to be like, I can breathe, you know? And then once you have that space of being able to breathe and not letting jealousy dictate a lot of those
Mm-hmm.
interactions, being able to like bring compersion into your life
Sure.
is such a joy. I love it.
Yeah.
Yeah, being able to find genuine happiness in the happiness of like so many people around you and in the relationships of people around you. So it's really fun to be like cuddling with
Yeah.
someone you care about deeply in bed and helping them brainstorm how they're going to show up on the date they have tomorrow.
Right.
Um, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and then have a different relationship that you go to later in that day that engages part of your mind, you know, and then being able to find a really deep connection over thought patterns or something, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like different, being able to appreciate all these different people in their uniqueness and in their unique ability. It's quite nice because different people bring out different aspects of yourself,
Yeah.
and being able to value that and value relationships, not have a hierarchical stamp of value in the relationships in your life, lets you let go of some of that possessive jealousy, lets you access that compersion happiness for other people, and lets you appreciate different relationships and the diversity that they bring to your life and like the different parts of you that they
Mm-hmm.
fulfill. As soon as you don't have that structure of hierarchy, yeah, you can bring a lot more value into it, and it feels just very nourishing and fulfilling and calming in the body as well, to be able to have that myriad of relationships and be able to find
Mm-hmm.
that nourishment and enjoyment within them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. To be held by so many different people that care for you and yeah, highlight the different aspects, the parts of you, which I think many of us understand easily in our society about platonic connections of like, yeah, I have these different friends that do these different things and they see different parts of me. But then there's often that restriction on what intimacy can look like, right? So then, yeah, to be able to snuggle, kiss, make love, fuck, right? Have kinky play, like just the full range with so many different people. You get so many different sides of yourself highlighted that we again in platonic connections we understand how one friend would never highlight all of us, right?
Mhm.
And so to be able to have that in so many different ways and to play with that and yeah, I published a guide on jealousy and combining a lot of the psychedelic work that I do. And I think that it's important to remember that in our psychedelic trips, it's never that we'll never have a bad trip, right? Even if you've done
Yeah.
thousand of psychedelic experiences, right? The reality is the first time is a little bit more intense than the fifth or the 10th, right? So we honor that for all of our newbies in this space. It is intense at the beginning, and that's often predicated upon your set and setting. Are you doing this with people who are talking to you, right? Did you come from purity culture like myself? Whoa,
Mm-hmm.
what a journey, you know? But even in that, you're 1,000 trips in, in the wrong mindset and setting, you can have an experience of jealousy that is intense. And so, how do we get curious about what's going on in that rather than beating ourselves up, getting curious about those factors? But in these expansive set and setting spaces, you can have beautiful psychedelic experiences that are full of so much pleasure. And I think it's so important to talk about that as part of the joys because if we continue with the metaphor of psychedelics for relationship anarchy and expansive relating, our current setting culturally is not conducive for this. No, I do not see enough of this out in the
Yes.
world. And so you are trying to do this experience in a really complex setting. So to have people like you, to have people like me who talk about, wow, to be clear, I feel really secure here. This space of
Mm-hmm.
all of these relationships, all these different people that love and show up for me, there's actually so much security here. Let me
Mm-hmm.
tell you, it is possible.
Totally.
Um,
Absolutely. I really like the bringing the set and setting into relationships, and like, because relationships are a trip. Like
Yes.
1000%. Um,
Yeah.
Relationships are a trip, and yeah, you're gonna have great ones and you're gonna have not so great ones, and a lot of it is set and setting. Do you have agency over, you have agency over your set to an extent that you can, sometimes you don't. That's okay. um, you
Yeah.
have less agency over your setting, but you can also access that agency. You can also engage in your community or in your politic and try and change that setting as well.
Mhm.
Um, so there's agency in both areas and there's lacks of agency in both areas. Yeah, that explains a lot for relationships and
Yeah.
navigating them and jealousy and these feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad to hear that the metaphor is resonating with you. It's definitely been how I've seen uh my life personally, the clients I have through the pleasure practice, my therapy clients, like this is sort of the lens, and I hope that the field of psychology in general does more of that work. We do so much understanding of the mindset and less of contextual setting, right? There like in my school, I got taught in like psychodynamics, CBT, humanistic, and then systems. Systems being like what sort of, cultural containers and things you're in. But why is that set out as something completely I mean, everything is about systems as well as your own set of what's going, oh no, and even like
Mhm.
psychodynamic theory will talk about how your parents messed you up, right? Like that is your setting and your relation.
Yeah.
Like I just hope we come to a space of deeper understanding rather than individualistic diagnoses into a broader set and setting of what's going on for people. And the setting part is often forgotten. You guys, we're struggling under capitalism, of course. That's,
Yeah.
like, oh my God, of course, right? So it's like, but I'll go down a rabbit hole there. So, the last question of the research today is, what do you wish other people knew about relationship anarchy?
That the fulfillment that you can feel and access, like how deep it is and how
Yeah.
nourishing that is, the security that you can feel, like you mentioned, how strong and warm and enriching that feels, talking with people about like alternative relationship styles or patterns. They'll say it's nice, but they'll diminish it next to monogamy, like, oh, that sounds fun, but once you find the person, you'll know, And I'm like, I really want people to know that like those feelings that you are desiring or accessing and that safety, that nourishment, that fulfillment that exists within relationship anarchy, and you can access that and feel that here. You don't have to, but you can, and
Hmm.
it does exist there, and it
Yeah.
isn't any less fulfilling, or the relationships aren't any less deep or strong because of the pattern.
Right, right, right. We talk about the excitement of a love story, right? And
Hmm.
all the joy, all the happiness, and then talk about doubling it, tripling it,
Yeah.
quadrupling it.
Yeah.
Whoa. Oh my God. Whoa. Like this is a level of love I've yet to experience before, and of course the realities are, time and energy are not abundant resources.
Hmm.
So the ways when I have four different love stories, they're all going in different directions. I can't see everybody the same amount of time, like so that's an finiteness of our humanness, right? Like that is always going to be there. But to be able to write that many stories of joy and that level of security, I mean, it is profound. And I think the biggest thing of the set and setting, right, is the community, the setting of the people. Because if you do this with people who say, I'm a relationship anarchist, you can't control me, I'm not going to sit down to have conversations with you, you would look at this and say, I will never do that drug again. That was the worst experience I've ever had of my life. And I would say that is
Totally.
super valid. That acid trip was in a very
Hmm.
bad setting. I respect your pain. I respect the validity of your suffering and your hurt. But to
Mhm.
know that another world is possible when you're in a different container, when you're in a different setting, oof. And oftentimes you can tell people about that. You can tell them about it, but it's until they see it, until they live into it in their own lived experience that they'll know that. Because otherwise, yeah, the setting for this is rough outside. So meeting the community, and then once you get tapped into that community, you start to notice like aspects of your life change. You're like, whoa, like everyone's really thoughtful, everyone's really good at communication. Like, of course, we're humans, so we still make mistakes, but damn, like this is a good circle. I like this.
Totally. Yeah,
Um,
it's nice. Like the skills that you have to develop to be able to do it in a good way are really nice skills to have people close to you. Like
yes.
for everybody to have those or be working on those is like it's
Mhm.
really nice. Because yeah, even when people do like mess up or you mess up or you know people get hurt for whatever reason, like being able to deal with that with a certain skill set and with a certain understanding is it's honestly it's really nice. um
Yeah.
yeah, within my like QPR,
Mhm.
having the dynamic of the three of us has been really nice and helpful when there has been like conflict that's naturally
Mhm.
arisen, and like
Right.
being able to have support on both sides and like, hey, like I think this person, if you just said like this like
Right.
one sentence, it would mean a lot to them. And you know, and then you do it, and then you're like, hey, that meant a lot to me, and you're like, oh, like that's
Mhm.
really nice. Like, yeah. So the setting is bad, and our sets are bad because of it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep. Yep.
but
I know.
but when you access that community, you can almost like on a certain scale, you can if you and you're intentional about the people that you're getting becoming intimate with, and you have a certain yeah, a certain skill set or a certain mindset even, and those other people do too, it almost creates a bit of a different setting. It's like as a microcosm within the larger setting that we exist within.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So well said. Mm. Well, as we come towards the end of our time today, I'm going to take a deep breath with you and then see if there's anything else that you'd want to share with the listeners. Otherwise, I can guide us towards our closing question.
If there was anything to share, it's if you enjoy dismantling hierarchies in the interpersonal, dismantle hierarchies within the community as well. And if you enjoy dismantling hierarchies within your community, dismantle them within in your interpersonal. Spread anarchy. That's the
Yeah.
message that I would like to share.
Hell yeah. So beautiful. Yes. All right. Well, if it feels good to you, we can go towards our closing question.
That
Okay.
sounds good.
So, the last question that I ask everyone on the podcast is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
Again, I've heard you ask this on the podcast many times.
So you knew.
I
It's different
knew.
when you're actually there, right?
It's different when you're on the other side of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the thing that I wish people knew was more normal? It's like building a relationship with yourself.
Mm,
Everybody does it, but I feel like nobody acknowledges it very strongly. It's a lot of times our relationships, when we talk about it, it's always about the other, the other, the other. And I wish people knew it was normal to take space and go on a walk by yourself.
yeah.
That's not a bad thing, you know? You don't have to feel like self-pity if you don't have anyone to hang out with on a given afternoon, and you cook for yourself and you listen to music with yourself and you do some writing or art with yourself. That's normal and it's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite things to do, both personally and to invite my clients to try, is journaling, right? I
Mhm.
wake up and journal, and what we're essentially doing is creating our story, creating our narrative. My relationship to self is in those words, like good morning, like here's the day, here's what's on my heart. Like that is me actively, instead of just thinking the narrative, taking the time to write it down and then to remember that I'm the author. You're the author, right? We're all the authors of our story. So if in the past, I get a lot of clients who like speak poorly of themselves, what would it mean to actually pause and rewrite a different sentence? Whether it's quite literally on the paper or in your mind. And I know working with clients, that feels radically uncomfortable. It's like riding a bike. You get on there and you say, what am I doing? I don't know. This is the first time I've told myself I love myself, right? It feels weird. But like any other skill, it becomes normal. It becomes easier. It becomes muscle memory. And so even just myself to look back on my journals from past times where it was not as loving and as kind to get to a space where I'm at now, I just love to invite people to grab that pen and paper and write it out and look in the mirror of your own words. What are you telling yourself about yourself? And then to remember your empowerment to write a whole new narrative and starting to step into that even though it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. 1000%.
Yeah.
Um, I love being able to find love and appreciation with oneself. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's normal to spend that time alone and take that time with yourself. But there's also so much value when it comes to putting in the work and bringing in that love and that care.
Absolutely. Well, I'll share my gratitude for you today. I really appreciate you for trusting me to come onto the podcast, to be vulnerable about your insights and your lived experience. And so I'm always honored when people take up the call to have this relationship anarchy interview. I'm so touched that you trusted me and could come on the podcast today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very honored to have been invited on, and it's been great. Thank you so much for
Yeah, of
all of the work
course.
that you do, and very excited to read your book some point in the future.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's been a blast. I appreciate that. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.